So, yes, I've got an awful lot to get through today. So, I'm going to try, before I get shouted at by Abbey in front, we're actually going to talk about two sites that we've been doing over this summer. We've been very busy. So, we're moving away from commercial archaeology now, more into the realm of research and community work. And in particular, I'm going to be talking to you about two of our research excavations, one in Wrexham and one a little bit further away in Flintshire. So, Croxton's Field and Basingwerk Abbey. So, two projects that we undertook this summer. One alongside the University of Chester and the other with the Greenfield Valley Heritage Park. And we're going to begin with Croxton's Field. So, right, fantastic site. This was a joint, as I say, a joint project with us and the University of Chester, funded by the University of Chester Departmental Research Funds and as well as Heneb resources and funding. Before we proceed, however, I'd like to point out this is not a publicly accessible piece of land. Private land, dairy farm, as tempted as you might be to go and see it, please don't. You'll have to enjoy it through my description alone. Right. So, and of course, you're going to be very privileged in seeing exactly where this site is today. It's located very close to the village of Holt, very historic centre village of Holt, and next to the River Dee. So River Dee being an area that we already know to be fairly prominent for archaeological sites in general. Few that I've highlighted here, you've got Poulton a little bit further to the north, is a very long-running excavation, multi-period site, a fantastic example of what can be achieved through a long-term period of research into archaeological sites in lowland, northwest and northeast Wales. We've also got the Holt Tile Works. So that's right next to, so Croxton's Field, you can see just down here, and then we just activate the laser pointer. We've got Holt right next to it, and the Holt Roman Tile Works. So this was an industrial site set up by the 20th Legion in the late 1st century for the production of tile and pottery to Chester, again, utilising the River Dee as its main source of transport. We've also got Townfield Lane just above. It's a temporary Roman encampment that is reused in the very early post-Roman, early medieval period for metal production or iron working. And then we've got Croxton's Field. Now, Croxton Field's particularly interestingly located. So again, being very close to the Holt Tile Works, which is a very substantial site. When we just think of an industrial site, you might underplay that in our minds. No, it's got a bathhouse, it's got a high status building with hypercourse, it's got a large barrack block, it's got very large facilities for producing bulk tile and pottery for all the needs of the Legion, both in Chester and all its associated outposts. Now, Croxton's Field itself is also particularly interestingly situated in terms of how it sits within the floodplain of the River Dee. As you can see, I've modelled here what it looks like when it's flooded, and believe you me, that is very accurate, as when we surveyed this, we were surrounded on 3 sides by water. We had to swim our way back to the car on several occasions. However, the land itself of Croxton's Field is hard, it's dry, and it stays hard and dry amongst that floodplain. So this site was originally discovered through the joint efforts of the Holt Local History Society and local metadetectorist Ray, who's sitting up the back up there. And they, well, hit the nail on the head, really, with small geophysical assessments in the north part of the field, which immediately identified potential features, which they then followed up with small-scale trial trenching, which in itself produced an incredible amount of material culture, predominantly Roman. So not hugely unsurprising, given how close we are to the tile works, but the quantity of it, but also the fact that the majority of what was found by them wasn't necessarily stuff that was made in Holt. It's stuff that's come from further afield. But some of the stars of the show are this Lion Head Key, which you'll have to take my word for that. That is what it is. And then there's a Wirral brooch right next to it. And then you can see in this picture here all the different, very large fragments of Roman pottery. You know, it's that stuff that's not very abraded. It's been thrown in a refuse heap. That's why it's got very nice, crisp edges to it. It's broken soon after use, hasn't been kicking around. But then also this, just to add the wild card into the assemblage, this was found through metal texturing by Ray. It's an Anglo-Saxon skeet, silver skeet, so that's dating to around about the 9th century. So this site really came to our attention once all this material was deposited with Wrexham Museum. And it got a combined, very excited call off Ray, determined for us to do more work, as well as Susie from the Portable Antiquities Scheme, who was adamant that more work needed to be done to understand where this stuff was coming from. So we followed that up with some high resolution geophysics with the aim of filling the entire field and getting a broad picture and image of what was going on. So a combination of myself and colleagues, I just took, with then later support from the University of Chester, filled the field with some absolutely fantastic results. It's very rare, especially in the geology of Wrexham, to be able to see such crisp results in magnetometry data like this. But just to explain it, if you can't quite see what's going on, I've got an interpretation here for you. You've got a road system running through the middle, then that's zigzagging through. Off that, a series of enclosures extending off it, smaller enclosures, larger enclosures on this side. And then what I suppose in geophysics we just call noise. But usually it's noise that's a little bit rectangular and stuff that we can narrow down to potentially being associated with a building. So an area in particular that grabbed our interest, so I would say that a lot of the Holt Society investigations focused on this part of the field. So that's where a lot of the Roman pottery is coming from, with that key and the metallic objects coming from this far corner up here, where there is the suggestion of possible structures, but through the majority of this area, there isn't much. And I would stress that geophysics is not a miracle. There are certain types of archaeology that it simply won't see, especially things like roundhouses or very simple timber structures. But the area that grabbed our attention were these here. There is a little run of much clearer structural features, one with a very clear rectangular structural outline here, another one which is again what we would probably describe as noise, but it's a relatively rectangular collection of noise, with in particular this little spike in the middle that often we associate with burning or activity relating to human activity. But also notice here that section of the trackway or road that's running through the site is particularly strong. So again, we wanted to try and sample that as an opportunity to date what could be a feature full of nice goodies associated with the occupation of the site. Because obviously in lieu of buildings, what we want to be able to do is find people's rubbish. Best way of identifying how long people have been on the site and what's been going on. So, jumping straight into that, Trench 1, which was Steve's trench, who is in the audience, I'm not sure where, there he is, and it didn't disappoint. Fantastic trackway. Now, it's not what you see as your large-scale sort of Roman roads with your curbs and your stonework, but it is a very well-made metalled road, probably an agger. So by that I mean they've cut a large pit and then filled up in the middle a camber and stone surface. And on either side of that, leaving a substantial ditch for drainage. And that is what has left that really strong anomaly in the data. And those ditches, both, although seem quite homogeneous singular fills, but that's possibly a product of the local geology on their site being incredibly difficult to separate in terms of colours and textures, making the site very similar to Boris, this being very, very close to Boris, in fact, difficult to pick apart. But within it, we did get Roman pottery, as well as this, a legionary stamped tile. So you can just about make out L-E-G. So in full, that would probably be Leg XXVV, 20th Legion Valera Victrix. However, frustratingly, the most datable element of these tiles tends to be the latter half, because this production began in the 1st century, for the construction of Chester. And that's when it was run by the Legion. So it's stamped by their legionary mark, Leg XXVV. However, in the later period, it becomes privatized. It's a thing you wouldn't expect to hear in the Romans, isn't it? But yes, it's privatized. And people add their own little signatures at the end. And they're usually what give us the much better date range for when that site was being used. However, the other pottery we got, Hartfield Mansetta, Mortaria wares, stuff that tends to be more towards the third century, so slightly later. However, I would stress that we have also had, certainly the stuff that came from the Holt Society excavations, tended to be the earlier stuff, so the stuff that was being made in Holt oxidised wares, but also Samian, the stuff imported by the Legion, black burnished wares, stuff like that. Now, the other trench, Trench 2, this was my trench, and so this is one chasing that particularly strong rectangular structure, and you can see that really clearly here. And that is the foundation of a timber structure. So it's post slots for upright timbers. Very simple, very, very simple. The internal surface, very lightly metalled floor. So when I say metaling, I just mean where they've got small, fine gravel stone, hammered it into the clay to make a nice solid surface. Artifactually, nothing. Absolutely diddly squat. Lots of charcoal within the fills, so charred timber, predominantly oak has been identified as. And there was daub, so thankfully we can say that it's probably a wattle and daub structure. There were some very small abraded fragments of Roman ceramic building material, so tile. But when I mean abraded and small, I mean very. So stuff that has been kicking around potentially for a very long time. So all that potentially tells us that this is something that probably post-dates the Roman period, as opposed to being Roman itself. Elsewhere in the trench, we also had an area in the middle that we struggled really to make sense of. Small post holes, with animal bone and some very difficult to find gullies. However, at the bottom end, we got one of the more substantial gullies that we can see that forms part of the enclosures and field systems around, which we could see in the geophysics. This was a nice V-cut ditch. V-cut we often tend to associate with the Romans. The fill of which was particularly interesting, though. There was a tipping layer that had been thrown in from the side where the buildings are. And it was full of bone, it was full of ash and other burnt waste. But notably, very little pottery. There was one very, very small abraded piece of pottery that's been again identified as 3rd century Roman, and it's an imported German ceramic. So again, it's not stuff that's necessarily local or nearby, but being so small and so highly abraded, probably something that's been kicking around for a very long time. And then we've got Trench 3. Now, this trench was a nightmare to make sense of. This was Caroline's trench. She drew a short straw for the trench that seemed like it was going to be very straightforward from the off, and it was not. Immediately from stripping it, it was littered with Roman ceramic building material, and I mean big stuff as well. So we're talking tegula, which is the rounded roof tile from the top, imbrex, the stuff underneath. Sorry, other way round, tegula, stuff underneath, imbrex, stuff on top. But also pili stack tiles, the stuff that we associate with hypercourse. All of it reused. There were some bits of Roman pottery, but heavily abraded, stuff that had been kicking around for a very long time. Now, it took a very long time for us to really be able to make sense of what was going on here, but the first most prominent feature was this here, and it is a hearth, a lovely stone-lined hearth, to which the wall of which incorporated bits of broken quernstone. So it's made of a burnt clay in the middle, stone lining, and had been heavily damaged by ploughing over the years, which realistically, it's that ploughing both in the medieval period and post-medieval period that made this structure so difficult to identify. But to help it make a little bit more sense, I've split this up into 3 colours just to explain it to you. And there's a few things I need you to remember as we go into the last slide. We've got this yellow area, that is internal structural. So they are, again, these structural walls, uprights. We've got an outer green, that is a drip gully. And then we've got the blue, they are more structural post holes. So combining that with the geophysics, what we can say from that is you've got this gable end here with a large post hole as part of it. We've lost it here. We've lost a lot there because that is unfortunately a later intrusion or excavation trench. Unfortunately, we don't have the results for. We've got some internal dividing post holes here set between part of the building. But this one was particularly interesting. It was the largest of all the post holes, but it was also set at an angle into the drip gully, extending at an angle toward the gable of the building. Remember that. It's important. Artifactually, though, stuff like this, nice little find that came up from the top above it. That's roughly 12th century. It's a medieval swivel, so part of a string fitting or strap fitting. But like I say, otherwise, aside from bone, CBM, stuff that's been reused, kicking around for a long time, very little. So, what have we got? To wrap that up, I think in combination with what we found and what the whole Local History Society found, we can fairly confidently say there is a Roman settlement sitting in the corner of this field, quite a substantial one, and potentially quite a long-lived one. It's probably been established around about the end, during the main works of the legionary tile works, which is a fairly reasonable assumption. But the majority of the material culture we're getting tends to suggest it's a little bit later, maybe towards when the settlement is being privatized. So these are the people who are operating potentially the settlement, or maybe the people who are with associated industries. Bearing in mind, something like tile works requires foresters, it requires clay quarries, a lot of additional industries that sit with it, but also agriculture. It's in a fantastic location for transporting goods into Chester, and that puts it more comparable with sites like Poulton, where we've got exactly the same. In terms of structures, what we've actually got and what people are living in, we still can't really confidently say. There is a potential that maybe we're looking at roundhouses. And is there a potential that the site was also in activity prior to the Romans arriving? We have got some Bronze Age pottery, very small fragments of. But also the interesting feature that you've got this long, lovely, straight section of road that then curves and diverts. Is it already reaching something that was already there? So that is a big question we would like to know, and it would help us define the type of community that are living there. Aside from that, you've got this area below it, which is your agricultural areas. So either side of that road is your large enclosures, your field systems. So again, that helps us to find that we are, at very least in part, looking at an agricultural settlement. But then there's this area just to the side. It is the odd one out. It's the sore thumb. It's buildings that don't quite align with what is the rest of what appears to be the core of the settlement. And bear in mind, I also said that we've got evidence that they're reusing Roman stuff, but the domestic wares that we'd usually associate with Roman occupation they've not been used. They are stuff that's been kicking around. It's abraded. It's residual, as we would refer to it. So that leaves us with only one really major alternative. We're either looking at something that is at the very end of the Roman period, or it dates to immediately after the Roman period. Now, look at this building. Do you remember that post hole at an angle that went into the drip gully? Look at those supports for the truss. This is an Anglo-Saxon longhouse or Anglo-Saxon farm hall. This is based on a reconstruction near Plymouth. And anyone who was a fan of Time Team back in the day will know that identifying Anglo-Saxon settlement is the holy grail of archaeology. They are so hard to define. And we are left in a tricky position at the moment because obviously, usually we will identify sites like this through material culture, but Anglo-Saxons, it doesn't survive. So we are very much reliant on our post-excavation process, which is still ongoing, and we're going to hopefully get some carbon dates out of the many bits of bone. The risk we've got, of course, is that there's a lot of Roman activity that's predated on this site, and it's going to be very difficult to differentiate between what is residual activity from the Romans and what is going to be potentially early medieval activity. Now, I would stress, however, with the potential for early med, bear in mind we had the Anglo-Saxon skeet, which was found on the site, but also we're right next to Farndon. Farndon, historically speaking, is very important in the early medieval period. It is the home and death place of Edward the Elder, widely regarded as the first king of the English. So particularly important. His palace is said to be located just to the north of Farndon. So that pretty much wraps up that site, and I'm going to move swiftly on before I run out of time to Basingwerk Abbey. So this is a site we've been undertaking with the Greenfield Valley Heritage Park, which was funded by the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. Now, the Greenfield Valley Heritage Park, if you've never heard of it, if you've never been, well, shame on you. It's a fantastic site. Brilliant little heritage park, our own little St. Fagans of the North. That's a very sweeping statement, I do apologise. But it incorporates the remains of Basingwerk Abbey, a Cistercian monastic site, and one of the most prominent scheduled monuments of Flintshire. It is, in fact, FL001 in its scheduled registry. So we arrived at this site in 2023 as part of future management programmes in order to be able to try and determine the extent of the scheduled areas, and we undertook this as a community research project within the park. Now, reasonably, it was assumed that all these fields that we were looking at around the Abbey, we were going to encounter significant medieval activity. You've got this large monastic complex with a fantastic area of flat ground around it, and a site that people have been buried in for many hundreds of years. So the assumption that there will be cemeteries, everything like that. But then there's obviously the golden rule in archaeology, never assume. And while we did find medieval material, very, very little of it was in context. And the majority of it is found in deposits which were associated with the dissolution. By that, of course, I mean Henry VIII. And the demolition of the Abbey. So loose materials with lots of mix of different time period medieval floor tiles, ceramics. But just to throw a little bit of an odd one out there, we've got this beautiful little thing here. Hiberno Norse, 10th century, what you might want to call Viking. I'm informed it is part of a baldric. That is not a Blackadder reference. That is its genuine name. So it's part of a strap fitting, and very ornately decorated, like the sort of thing that's coming out of Dublin. That was found within a large ditch, but unfortunately in a very mixed context. What did stand out, however, was the amount of Roman artefacts that we recovered from the site. So, like I said, no definitively in situ medieval remains, no cemetery, certainly, but in situ Roman activity from both sides of the Abbey, both our area to the north of Basingwerk House and in the fields below. And it was a makeup of predominantly late 1st and early 2nd century pottery that to the north of Basingwerk House was coming out of large defensive cut ditches, one with a definitive Roman date, the other one with an apparent medieval recut. And then down here, it was in what was a relatively small trench, small cut features that were very difficult to make sense of at the time, but definitively Roman, as they were producing Roman material from their fills. Stone spreads, post holes, and possible industrial features that, again, at the time we were looking at this archaeology through a keyhole, so it was very difficult to make sense of. So we wanted to follow that up and do some additional targeted trenching. Now, I would note at this point that we weren't the first to find Roman archaeology on this site. Commercial work that was undertaken as part of the expansion of the visitor centre by Earthworks Archaeology did also identify some Roman ceramics and possible contemporary Roman features, but again, they were from very small trial holes. Ministry of Works excavations within the Abbey, or their clearance of the Abbey, and I mean industrial clearance of the Abbey, using rail tracks and everything, they also recovered Roman ceramics, which at the time was largely overlooked because it's not an unusual thing to find on monastic sites. They tended to be the antiquarians of the day monks. So we wanted to elaborate on the success previously. Unfortunately, we couldn't carry on at the back of Basingwerk House. Logistically, the ditches, which we really were keen to look at, were too deep and it was too small an area for us to safely excavate. So we focused on what was Trench 5 in 2023, opening up a much larger area to try and make sense of those smaller features, and also tried to get as close as we could with a hand dig trench to what Earthworks had found in 2017, and also getting as close as we could to the historic Abbey farm, just to be able to test areas that weren't heavily disturbed by the Industrial Revolution. So, Trench 1. Fantastic trench, by far, but it's going to take some walkthrough for you to really show you what's going on in this trench. This is a mid-excavation photogrammetry model. What have we got? First, another ditch, big one. Again, so the previous ones, we were never able to get the full width of them or the full depth. They were just too deep. 45-degree angle cut and a width probably exceeding 4 meters. So realistically, the depth we were going to get into 3 meters. We were reaching a point where it was not safe. This one, the fill of which, medieval. In addition to that, circular alignment of post holes. At this point, they had been half-sectioned. Then a platform defined by a stone outline and gully, in the centre of which, a beautiful hearth, stone lined with a pot stone on the side. So this is the large flat top stone that you would stick your cooking pots on while in use. So very much a domestic hearth. And then also a mussel shell oven. So one very large oval oven with a thick layer of fire-cracked stone and then a very thick layer of mussel shell, which, as we've discovered, is very difficult to process environmentally, as it turns to something of the consistency of paper mache. And then below that, another ring feature. So if you haven't guessed what we're looking at, it's something along these lines. Roundhouses. Lots of them, at least 3, and Olympic rings of roundhouses. And that happens as these sites tend to be, roundhouses don't tend to be used for very long. Anyone who has tried, any heritage park that's tried to build these buildings will know very well that they are very difficult to maintain. So eventually they have an expiration date. So someone has built a roundhouse on a platform, it has been knocked down, they built another one nearby, and then a generation later, they've rebuilt another one, reoccupying the same platform. Now, what date? So, one of the roundhouses, first one that we're terming Roundhouse A, this is the one that was defined by relatively small post holes, but very regularly spaced. Quite simple in their construction. There is no obvious drip gully, but I can say from experience of downpours that we had during this excavation that there is no need for drainage. It drains away very quickly, very free draining ground. The majority of these post holes, or at least half of these post holes, produced Roman material from their backfills. So suggesting that A, they are all part of a contemporary feature, but they are of a Romano-British date. But most significantly, in the area in the centre, we had what appeared to be this spread or surface of stone with charcoal and a lot of domestic debris, including pottery, fantastic range of Roman pottery that is very uncommon in this part of the world, especially on Romano-British sites. But also, one of the star finds, our late Iron Age Triskel Mount. So found by Edward up there. Edward, it's all downhill from now. Okay. This is a particular rare find for Britain in general. We do find them, but they tend to be very fragmentary. But they're of a type and design that are made by the British, and there's a suggestion that one of the main manufacturing sites may in fact have been Prestatyn, not very far away from Basingwerk Abbey. They are part of a horse mount, More than that, we can't really say because there are too few of them to really fully understand. But rather conveniently, they of course include what is effectively our corporate logo, the Triskel design, which is very much that Celtic Romano-British style. It incorporates four stone mounts within it as well, and it's bronze. So it's currently gone for conservation, and hopefully will be returning for display in Flintshire. In addition to that, a fantastic range of Roman finewares. Again, stuff that is not just local, it's stuff that has been brought from further afield, including the southern Gaulish, so southern France, Roman Samian ware, which you can see this one, fantastic design art. You've got a hunting dog and hares, as well as deers. You can see just detached antler, so a hunting scene. But also fantastic black burnish ware dishes and fairly well surviving. But again, I can't stress enough, this is quite an unusual thing to find in the context of Romano-British roundhouses in northeast Wales, but also the fact that they are all fairly tightly dated to the late 1st and early 2nd century AD. So that is the period of the invasion of North Wales, effectively. That is the Legion establishing themselves in North Wales. So that other area in the top of this trench, that's the area we've got a particularly complex sort of stratigraphy. And that's brilliant for us because although it's a lot to try and get our head around, it helps us to phase site to a great extent. So you can see here in this section, we've got that medieval cut ditch. That is cutting a deposit here, which is an abandonment or post-occupation deposit from the Romano-British period. That included this little spout, which at first doesn't look particularly exciting, but I assure you it is. It is from a tetina. It is a baby feeding bottle. They're particularly rare, and often only found on a military context, or in a military context, sorry. So that in itself sealed an early fill of a V-cut ditch, which was part of a gully surrounding that house platform. That cut the shell oven, which notably had no ceramics in it at all. And that cut an earlier gully that was, you can see just poking out here, that again respected that house platform. So no ceramics in it. Is it Iron Age? Have we got occupation predating the arrival of the Romans? So moving on to Trench 2, we didn't reach a full conclusion in this trench because we got to the point where it was far too deep. It seemed as we moved further west in this field, the deeper the deposits became. But what we can say, you can see all this concentration of stone. It's all stone, mortar, roof tile, demolition. It's associated with the demolition of the Abbey. So again, it's got a mixture of medieval material. However, one of the most notable things from it, which only really made itself apparent in post-excavation process, is that's the alignment of that ditch that we have in Trench 1. It runs through the middle of this trench. And what was noted about this demolition spread is that it was tipping into something. So it's a very good chance that we picked up part of that ditch, but unfortunately it had already reached a point where it was far too deep for us to ever be able to excavate. Now, Trench 3, which is Steve's trench, this was the area that was located right next to the visitor centre. This was a hand-dug trench, I want to stress. So this was a very well-worked achievement by the end of the 2 weeks from open to close. And again, aside from obviously a lot of modern interference in this trench, which you can see from the communication cable, but also the other pits and trenches that were dug into one side. However, the other side, quite a lot of complex in situ archaeology, including another V-cut gully with a rough circular outline, which I would like to suggest is probably, again, a gully. Steve would probably disagree. It is truncating another feature, which appears to be a rob-out, possibly of a wall, which next to it has the remains of a floor, which again have been heavily truncated. And then another pit in the side, this one more likely to be of medieval origin. But the interesting thing is the finds, really, amongst these. Again, very nicely dating them to both Roman with later disturbance associated in the medieval period. Some of the best medieval finds actually we had in the entire excavation were found in the disturbed layers, which you can see this lovely ceramic here, but also this coin of the Emperor Trajan. So it's dating to around about 110 AD. And one thing that's particularly beautiful about it is almost uncirculated condition, which is brilliant in terms of dating, because that would suggest that it's not been kicking around for very long before it was dropped in the ground. So fantastic result. And then also moving to trench 4. So this was very much our post-medieval trench. We picked up this fantastically built wall outline, which ties in with the wall that we can see here in the second edition Ordnance Survey map. But what we really noted from excavating it is that it was a little bit more than just your bog standard boundary wall. And what was found on the interior was much different to the exterior surfaces, suggesting potentially more likely to be associated with structure. Now, what I would note is that this is the second edition map. And you can see here, you've got this hollow outline of a rectangular, what looks like an enclosure. It's not, it's an unroofed building, but because it's unroofed, it's shown as hollow. In the previous first edition, it's shown as roofed. Have we got the same here? Because it's particularly, although it's not quite rectangular, it's an unusually narrow field, if it is an enclosure. But interestingly, a lot of the material we found from the interior of it were early sort of cast iron agricultural debris. So it is likely to be associated with the Abbey farm. Notably, though, we still found Roman ceramics. So it appears no matter where you excavate in Greenfield Valley, you are going to find some Roman, whether it's in situ or not. Now, so let's wrap that up. So what have we got? Starting with the defensive ditches. We have an apparent enclosure that is going around Basingwerk Abbey. Now, in order to explain how this might make sense to you, I need to give you a little bit of a history lesson. So Basingwerk Abbey, or what is presently Basingwerk Abbey, was established in 1157 at the conclusion of the Berwyn campaigns and the wars between the Welsh and the English, namely in this area, Owain Gwynedd and Henry II. So this is also at the end of the conclusion of the Battle of Ewloe, for which Basingwerk had been Owain Gwyned's staging post. At this period, there had also been a Basingwerk castle, for which we don't really know the location, nor do we know the location of the original Basingwerk Abbey, which was originally a Savignac foundation established in 1132. Now, what we do know is during the Berwyn campaign is that Basingwerk Castle was destroyed, and the castle was rebuilt after. And at the conclusion of the Berwyn campaign, all of the lands that Owain Gwynedd had acquired of northeast Wales were given back, albeit temporarily. And when the abbey was rebuilt, it's referred to as an abbey with a ditch. Was it built within the remains of Basingwerk Castle? So do we have both the site of Basingwerk Castle and the site of the re-established Basingwerk Abbey? That would certainly explain why we've got such substantial defensive ditch network going around the Abbey, but it goes some way to explain why the layout of the Abbey is more like the sort of thing we'd find in an urban context. It's very squashed together, very compressed. And given that all the land around it is very flat, perfectly good enough for building, is that because it's been built within an existing enclosure for its own defence? But also note that that existing enclosure, if so, is very rectangular. Is it reoccupying the site of a Roman fort? Where Basingwerk Abbey sits, it overlooks one of the main Roman roads that runs through North Wales from Chester to Carnarvon, and it's at Basingwerk that road turns. And there's a suggestion that it also might be a junction with another spur road, recently identified, heading towards Prestatyn. So not only is it overlooking the road, it's overlooking a junction of the Roman road. So in addition to that, obviously, we've got all our roundhouses. They're scattered around. So, actually, going back to that, obviously, I've got some early geophysics that's overlaid there. Note this fantastic broad negative anomaly. This is a GSB survey from the 1990s, which I think is still perfectly relevant in terms of how accurate it's been. The orientation of this linear feature perfectly correlates with the potential outline of our ditch. Bear in mind, this outline here is only one side of said ditch, but also these structural features that were identified and have been recently re-identified through a combination of magnetometry and ground penetrating radar. They are buildings, but they don't appear to correlate with the layout of the Abbey, suggesting they're either later or earlier. Now, some are suggesting that they may be later because there's also a 19th century field boundary that respects this orientation. I would argue no, maybe earlier, and that is now a big focus with CADU. We need to really get a sense of what these structures are. So obviously the roundhouses we are finding on either side of the Abbey potentially. You've got the definitive ones to the south, but also around those defensive ditches, we did have stone-packed post holes, but not enough to really definitively identify a roundhouse. We've got the features in Trench 3. We've also got the features underneath the visitor centre. A very tight date range for all the pottery we are getting associated with the Roman period, but I would stress that if we do have an Iron Age presence on this site, that is not going to be represented in pottery. North Wales, there just simply isn't any Iron Age pottery, and it makes those sort of sites incredibly difficult to identify. What we do also have, however, is going back to the 1700s, a hypercourse. It was identified by Thomas Pennant, a very well-respected historian or antiquarian of the day, who, during the construction of the copper rolling sheds, and like I said, the Industrial Revolution hit Greenfield Valley very hard, a series of hypercourse stacks were identified, and he identified them as Roman. And he was a very well-travelled man, so he will have seen hypercourse from Rome. However, after that, or since that, archaeologists dismissed his conclusion, suggesting that, oh, well, it's probably more likely to be a tile kiln associated with the Abbey. We have got a whopping great big Abbey right next door. And logically speaking, that would have made sense at the time. But as I've pointed out, we're now getting far more Roman activity on this site than we are getting medieval. So that brings that question back, was Thomas Pennant right? So have we got a hypercourse? So if that's a hypercourse, for anyone who is not familiar with what that is, it's an underfloor heating system. So that would be associated with either a bathhouse, which no Roman fort would go without, certainly no permanent Roman fort, or a villa. So either could be perfectly plausible. Now, bearing in mind, when I say the pottery, we seem to have a cut-off date in our pottery at the moment at the end of the 2nd century. So we've got a Romano-British population that is very actively trading with the Romans, both with the metalwork that they're producing, but also all the beautiful fine wares that the Romans are now bringing into Britain. Certainly shows a very cooperative relationship compared to what is being suggested in Pembrokeshire. And that has a cut-off date. So where did these people go? Did the settlement fizzle out? Did it simply end? Was it just effectively eating off the presence of the Roman legion? And once they were gone, they either followed or they left. Or did they Romanize? So have we got people that have gone from living in roundhouses, very actively trading and embracing Roman material culture at very least, and then maybe by the end of the 3rd century, they have fully Romanized and they've built a villa on site. Unfortunately, we'll never know because the Industrial Revolution built a whopping great big copper rolling mill over it. So it will always ever be speculative. But I would say this is forming part of a bigger picture now of Roman archaeology in this part of the world. And I would really stress that it is about time we stop using the term hinterland to describe the area around Chester, a word that has basically followed what is a lack of surviving archaeological sites found in this part of the world. And it is becoming very clear that that is not true. They are hard to find, don't get me wrong. Geology doesn't help. Lack of material culture often doesn't help, but they are there.